A nation built on chains. America did not begin with freedom, it began with labor, and that labor was forced. Long before the nation declared itself a symbol of liberty, before its flags and constitutions and promises, its economy was already dependent on human bondage. The early 19th century United States presented itself to the world as a young republic founded on ideals of equality and self-determination, yet beneath that language existed a system so violent, so normalized, and so profitable that it shaped every institution the country would build. Slavery was not a side effect of early America, it was its foundation. The wealth that allowed cities to rise, industries to expand, and political power to consolidate was extracted from bodies that had no rights, no legal existence, and no protection. Enslaved people were not considered citizens, nor even fully human in the eyes of the law. They were property, recorded alongside livestock and tools, inherited, traded, insured, and destroyed as assets. By the early 1800s, slavery had become deeply entrenched in American life. Entire regions depended on it. Cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice plantations produced immense wealth for landowners, merchants, and financial institutions, while enslaved laborers endured conditions designed not for survival, but for maximum extraction of work before death. The plantation system was not chaotic cruelty, it was organized, calculated, and managed with precision. Every hour of daylight was accounted for. Every movement was monitored. Violence was not random, it was instructional. Whippings, brandings, shackles, and mutilation were tools of discipline meant to terrorize not only the individual punished, but everyone who witnessed it. Fear was the currency that kept the system running. Enslaved people lived under constant surveillance. Overseers patrolled fields with weapons. Slave patrols roamed roads, forests, and waterways, empowered by law to stop, search, beat, and kill those suspected of escape. These patrols were not informal mobs, they were organized, state-sanctioned forces, often made up of local white men required to serve. Their purpose was simple: to ensure that black bodies remained controlled. In many ways, these patrols represented some of the earliest forms of organized policing in America, designed not to protect the public, but to protect property defined as human beings. The daily life of an enslaved person was marked by exhaustion and deprivation. Food was scarce and nutritionally inadequate, calculated only to keep bodies functioning. Clothing was minimal, often unchanged for years. Shelter was crude, overcrowded, and unsanitary. Illness spread easily, yet medical care was rarely provided unless the enslaved person's labor was deemed valuable enough to preserve. Even then, treatment was experimental, invasive, and brutal. Enslaved people were frequently subjected to medical procedures without consent, used by doctors as test subjects for new techniques, their pain dismissed as irrelevant. Families existed under constant threat of destruction. Marriage between enslaved people had no legal recognition. Children belonged not to their parents, but to the enslaver. A mother could raise her child for years only to watch them sold to settle a debt or increase profit. Fathers were powerless to protect their families. Brothers, sisters, grandparents, entire kinship networks were erased by the logic of the market. The trauma of separation was not accidental, it was a weapon. Enslavers understood that breaking family bonds weakened resistance and reinforced submission. Women experienced a distinct and often unspoken violence. In addition to the same labor demands placed on men, enslaved women were subjected to routine sexual assault. Rape was not considered a crime when committed against an enslaved woman. Children born from these assaults increased the enslaver's wealth, creating a system where sexual violence was financially incentivized. The law offered no protection. Silence was survival. Pregnancy did not excuse women from labor, and childbirth was often followed by immediate return to work, sometimes within days. Infant mortality was high, and grief was a luxury few could afford. Children were not spared. From an early age, they were trained to work, conditioned to obey, and punished to instill fear. Childhood, as a protected stage of life, did not exist for the enslaved. By adolescence, they were expected to perform adult labor. By adulthood, many were already physically broken. Education was forbidden, as literacy was seen as a threat. Knowledge meant possibility, and possibility meant danger to the system. Religion was used as a tool of control. Enslavers selectively taught religious texts that emphasized obedience, submission, and suffering as divine will. Passages about liberation and justice were omitted. Churches preached that slavery was part of a natural order, ordained by God. Resistance, therefore, was framed not only as criminal, but as sinful. Yet enslaved people created their own spiritual traditions in secret, songs, prayers, and stories that encoded hope, resistance, and survival beneath layers of metaphor. The legal system reinforced every aspect of this violence. Courts treated enslaved people as objects. Testimony from black individuals was often inadmissible. Crimes committed against enslaved people were rarely punished. Laws restricted movement, assembly, and communication. Even free black people in the North lived under constant threat of kidnapping, falsely accused of being runaways and sold into slavery. Freedom was fragile, conditional, and easily stolen. Economically, slavery extended far beyond plantations. Northern industries depended on Southern cotton. Banks financed plantations. Insurance companies insured enslaved people as assets. Shipping companies transported goods produced by forced labor. Politicians protected the system because their power depended on it. Slavery was not a regional issue, it was a national enterprise. Resistance existed everywhere, though history often minimizes it. Enslaved people sabotaged equipment, slowed work, feigned illness, preserved culture, and planned escapes. Some revolted openly, knowing the consequences would be death. Others fled north along dangerous routes that would later be called the Underground Railroad. These acts were not desperate gambles, they were assertions of humanity in a system designed to erase it. By the time the Civil War approached, America was already fractured. The nation had built its wealth on contradictions it could no longer ignore. Freedom and slavery could not coexist indefinitely, yet even as the war ended legal slavery, its logic survived. Systems of control adapted. Laws changed language, not intent. Prisons, labor contracts, and segregation replaced chains with new forms of restraint. The United States would go on to describe itself as a beacon of liberty, but its earliest centuries tell a different story. A nation cannot be understood by its promises alone, it must be understood by its foundations. America rose because millions were forced to their knees. Its institutions grew strong while entire populations were denied humanity. The chains that built the nation did not vanish, they left marks, deep and lasting, etched into law, culture, and memory. This is where the American story truly begins. Not with freedom declared, but with freedom denied. Not with dreams realized, but with lives consumed to make those dreams possible. To understand America, one must first confront the truth that its birth was paid for in suffering, and that the echoes of those chains still shape the world that followed. The plantation lie. The American plantation has long been wrapped in myth. In paintings, novels, and memory, it appears as a place of order and tradition, white-columned houses standing calmly above endless fields, attended by loyal workers and guided by benevolent masters. This image was not accidental. It was manufactured, repeated, and protected because it concealed a truth too violent to be comfortably remembered. The plantation was not a symbol of refinement or stability. It was a factory of suffering, engineered to extract maximum labor from human bodies through fear, hunger, and force. Its elegance was a costume worn over brutality. Plantations were not communities, they were labor camps. Every structure, routine, and rule existed for one purpose: production. Fields were measured not by beauty but by yield. Enslaved people were evaluated not by skill or humanity but by output. Dawn did not signal a new day, it marked the beginning of compulsory labor. Bells, horns, or overseers' shouts pulled workers from exhausted sleep and drove them into the fields regardless of illness, injury, pregnancy, or age. Rest was considered waste. Mercy was considered weakness. The plantation system was meticulously organized. Enslaved people were divided into work gangs based on age, strength, and perceived usefulness. The strongest were placed in the most demanding roles, working under constant supervision. Children, the elderly, and the injured were assigned lighter tasks, but none were exempt from labor. Even those who could barely stand were expected to contribute. The plantation did not pause for sickness or grief. Death itself was treated as an inconvenience, noted in records only as a loss of value. Overseers functioned as enforcers, their authority maintained through violence. Many were hired specifically for their cruelty. Their success was measured by productivity, not morality. Whippings were public and deliberate, carried out to remind everyone of the consequences of resistance or perceived laziness. Punishments were often inflicted for reasons unrelated to work, speaking without permission, failing to show deference, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Pain was arbitrary by design. When punishment feels unpredictable, fear becomes permanent. Food on plantations was intentionally inadequate. Enslaved people were fed the cheapest rations possible, cornmeal, fatback, scraps, calculated to sustain labor without encouraging strength or independence. Malnutrition was common, weakening immune systems and making bodies more vulnerable to disease. Clothing was issued infrequently, often once a year, regardless of where or weather. Shoes were considered optional, even for field laborers working in extreme heat or cold. Shelter consisted of cramped, poorly constructed cabins that offered little protection from the elements. Overcrowding was the norm. Privacy did not exist. Medical care, when provided, served the plantation's interests, not the patient's. Enslaved people were treated as experimental subjects. Pain relief was rare. Procedures were performed without consent. Women were subjected to invasive gynecological experiments under the assumption that black bodies felt less pain, a belief fabricated to justify cruelty. Injuries caused by labor were often ignored until they threatened productivity. Once a body was no longer useful, it was discarded. The most enduring violence of the plantation was psychological. Enslaved people were constantly reminded of their status. They were required to display submission through posture, language, and behavior. Eye contact could be punished. Silence was enforced. Individual identity was stripped away and replaced with labels: hand, field worker, breeder. Names were altered or erased. This systematic dehumanization was essential to maintaining control. A person who is denied humanity is easier to exploit. Family life existed only at the permission of the enslaver. Couples could be separated at any moment. Children were taken without warning. Parents lived with the constant knowledge that love was a liability. Attachment made loss inevitable. This instability was intentional. A population constantly grieving is less able to organize, resist, or hope. The plantation relied on broken bonds to function smoothly. Sexual violence was embedded in the system. Enslaved women were vulnerable to assault by enslavers, overseers, and other white men who faced no legal consequences. Rape was not considered a crime against an enslaved woman, it was treated as an act of ownership. Children born from these assaults inherited enslaved status, increasing the enslaver's wealth. In this way, sexual violence became an economic strategy. Trauma was profitable. The image of the kind master was one of the plantation's most dangerous myths. Occasional gestures of leniency, extra food, reduced punishment, or permission for a family to remain together, were framed as generosity rather than what they were: manipulation. These moments were used to reinforce dependence and gratitude, to suggest that survival was a gift rather than a stolen right. Any reduction in cruelty was presented as kindness, obscuring the violence that made such kindness meaningful. Plantations were deeply connected to global markets. Cotton grown by enslaved hands fueled textile industries across the world. Sugar sweetened European wealth. Tobacco filled international demand. The plantation was not isolated, it was central to global capitalism. Banks extended credit based on enslaved people's bodies. Insurance policies were written on their lives. Profits flowed far beyond the fields, implicating merchants, financiers, and governments in the violence. Resistance never disappeared, despite the risks. Enslaved people slowed work, sabotaged tools, preserved language and culture, and passed down stories that affirmed their humanity. Some poisoned livestock or crops. Others escaped, navigating forests, rivers, and hostile territory in pursuit of freedom. Revolts, though rare due to overwhelming force, terrified enslavers because they revealed the truth. Submission was not consent. After emancipation, the plantation myth survived. It was romanticized to soften memory and protect national identity. The suffering was minimized. The violence reframed as discipline. The enslaved recast as passive participants in their own oppression. This revision of history was not innocent. It was necessary for a nation that wanted to celebrate progress without confronting its cost. The plantation was never a place of harmony. It was a controlled environment built on terror, designed to turn human lives into profit. Its legacy did not end with slavery. It shaped labor systems, racial hierarchies, and economic inequality long after the fields fell silent. To understand America, one must strip away the romance and confront the plantation for what it truly was: a lie sustained by violence, and a cornerstone of a nation built on exploitation. Stolen continents. Native America's destruction. Long before the United States imagined itself as a nation, the land already held nations of its own. They were not empty spaces waiting for discovery, nor scattered tribes wandering aimlessly across wilderness. They were civilizations, diverse, complex, and deeply rooted. From the forests of the Northeast to the plains, deserts, rivers, and coasts, Native American societies had lived, governed, traded, worshipped, and adapted for thousands of years. Their relationship to the land was not one of ownership alone, but of responsibility, memory, and survival. What followed was not settlement. It was invasion. European arrival marked the beginning of a catastrophe that would unfold over centuries. Disease arrived first, moving faster than armies. Entire communities were erased by illnesses they had no immunity against. Smallpox, measles, influenza, these were not merely biological accidents but weapons of consequence. Populations collapsed before formal conquest even began, leaving societies weakened, grieving, and vulnerable. Where once there had been thriving nations, silence spread. Land emptied not by nature, but by loss. As European colonies expanded and later transformed into the United States, native land became an obstacle to ambition. Expansion required space for farms, towns, railroads, and wealth. Native presence stood in the way. Treaties were drafted not as agreements between equals, but as tools of delay, deception, and eventual theft. Promises were made with full knowledge they would be broken. Land was signed away under coercion, misunderstanding, or threat. When treaties no longer served their purpose, they were ignored entirely. Violence followed policy with disturbing consistency. Military campaigns targeted native villages, destroying homes, crops, and food stores. These attacks were often timed for winter, when survival depended on preparation. Starvation was not collateral damage, it was strategy. Entire communities were left without resources, forced to flee or submit. Survivors carried trauma that could not be measured in numbers alone. The language of justification was carefully crafted. Native Americans were labeled savages, obstacles, or relics of a dying past. Their cultures were dismissed as inferior, their spiritual systems mocked or demonized. This dehumanization made removal easier to accept. A people defined as primitive could be erased without guilt. The violence of expansion was reframed as progress, destiny, even divine will. Nowhere was this destruction more visible than in the policy of forced removal. In the early 19th century, the United States government formalized what settlers had already practiced. Native nations in the Southeast, Cherokee, Muskogee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, were expelled from their ancestral lands to make way for white settlement. This was not negotiation. It was expulsion backed by military force. The removals were carried out through marches that would later be known collectively as the Trail of Tears. Families were driven from their homes with little warning. They were forced to walk hundreds of miles through harsh terrain with inadequate food, clothing, or shelter. Elderly people collapsed along the way. Children died from disease and exposure. Bodies were buried quickly or left behind. Grief became constant. Survival became uncertain. These marches were not accidents of poor planning. They were conducted with indifference to suffering. Death was anticipated and accepted as part of the process. The goal was not humane relocation, it was clearance. The land was needed. The people were expendable. Those who survived removal arrived in unfamiliar territory stripped of sovereignty and resources. Promised aid often failed to arrive. Conflicts arose as displaced nations were forced into overcrowded lands. Traditional ways of life were disrupted. Languages weakened. Ceremonies faded. The destruction was not only physical but cultural. Even Native Americans who attempted to adopt European customs were not spared. The Cherokee Nation, which had developed a written language, formal government, and agricultural economy, sought coexistence through adaptation. They appealed to U.S. courts and won legal recognition of their sovereignty. The ruling was ignored. Law offered no protection when it conflicted with power. Beyond removal, the United States pursued a campaign of assimilation. Native children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to erase their identity. Their hair was cut. Their languages were forbidden. Their names were changed. They were punished for practicing their traditions. The goal was explicit: to kill the Indian and save the man. Cultural genocide replaced military conquest, continuing destruction under the guise of education. Economically, native lands were stripped and exploited. Gold discoveries led to invasions regardless of treaty boundaries. Railroads cut through sacred territories. Hunting grounds were destroyed, deliberately eliminating food sources to force dependence. The buffalo slaughter was not incidental, it was encouraged. By destroying a cornerstone of plains cultures, the government ensured submission. Resistance never vanished. Native nations fought, negotiated, adapted, and endured. Leaders rose to defend their people with diplomacy or arms. Some battles were won. Most were not. The imbalance of power was overwhelming. Yet survival itself became resistance. Culture persisted in secret. Stories were passed down. Identity endured despite relentless pressure to disappear. By the late 1800s, Native Americans had been confined to reservations, often the least desirable land available. Poverty, disease, and neglect replaced autonomy. Government agents controlled resources, movement, and education. Sovereignty existed mostly in name. The continent had been stolen, piece by piece, justified by law, enforced by violence, and sanitized by history. The destruction of Native America was not a single event. It was a process, methodical, adaptive, and sustained. It reshaped the land and the nation that claimed it. The United States expanded because native nations were removed. Its wealth grew because indigenous land was seized. Its identity formed through the erasure of those who came before. To tell the story of America without this truth is to tell a lie. The nation was not born into empty space. It was carved out through displacement, death, and denial. The continents were not discovered. They were taken. And the cost was paid by people whose histories were nearly erased, but never truly gone. Children of the machine age. The industrial age arrived in America with promises of progress, efficiency, and prosperity, but for millions of children it brought something far different. It brought noise that never stopped, air thick with dust and smoke, hours that stretched beyond endurance, and a childhood cut short by labor. As factories rose and machines replaced handcraft, children became one of the most valuable resources of the new economy. Their small bodies fit easily between gears and looms. Their hands were quick, their wages low, and their voices powerless. Progress, it turned out, was built on their exhaustion. By the early 19th century, industrialization transformed American cities and towns into centers of production. Textile mills, coal mines, steel plants, and workshops demanded constant labor. Machines did not rest, and neither did the children who fed them. Boys and girls as young as 5 or 6 years old were pulled into the workforce, not as apprentices learning a trade, but as replaceable parts of an industrial system that consumed them. Poverty left families with little choice. When survival depended on wages, childhood became negotiable. Factories operated from before sunrise until late into the night. Shifts commonly lasted 12 to 16 hours. Children rose in darkness and returned home in darkness, if they returned home at all. Inside the mills, the environment was relentless. Air filled with cotton fibers damaged lungs. Machinery roared so loudly that hearing loss became common before adolescence. Floors were slick with oil and blood. Safety guards were rare, and injuries frequent. Fingers were crushed. Arms were torn away. Some children were killed outright, their deaths quietly absorbed as the cost of doing business in coal mines. Children worked underground in conditions few adults could endure. They crawled through narrow tunnels hauling heavy loads, their backs bent permanently under strain. Many served as trappers, sitting alone in darkness for hours, opening and closing ventilation doors, breathing cold dust and growing up without light. Cave-ins, explosions, and toxic gases were constant threats. When accidents occurred, the response was not reform but replacement. Another child could always be found. Education became a luxury. School attendance was inconsistent or non-existent for working children. Illiteracy remained widespread among the working class, reinforcing cycles of poverty and dependence. Employers preferred it that way. An educated child asked questions. A tired, hungry child obeyed. The future was sacrificed to maintain control in the present. The ideology of the era framed this exploitation as necessity. Industrial leaders argued that child labor taught discipline and responsibility. Newspapers praised industrious youth while ignoring broken bodies. Reformers were dismissed as sentimental or unpatriotic, accused of threatening economic growth. The nation celebrated invention and expansion while refusing to confront who paid the price. Girls faced particular forms of exploitation. In factories, they earned less than boys for the same work and were subject to constant harassment. In domestic labor, young girls were sent to live in the homes of wealthier families as servants, isolated from their own communities and vulnerable to abuse. Their labor was invisible, their suffering private, their options limited. Immigrant children were especially vulnerable. Families arriving from Europe in search of opportunity often found themselves trapped in urban slums where factory wages were the only means of survival. Language barriers, discrimination, and fear of authorities made resistance unlikely. Employers exploited this desperation, pitting workers against one another and ensuring silence through threat of unemployment or deportation. The physical toll of child labor was severe, but the psychological damage was equally enduring. Children raised in factories learned early that their worth was measured by productivity. Pain was normalized. Fatigue became permanent. Play, imagination, and security, essential elements of childhood, were replaced by routine and fear. Many grew into adulthood already broken, carrying injuries and trauma that limited their futures. Reform did not come quickly, nor did it come willingly. Laws restricting child labor were weak, inconsistently enforced, or deliberately ignored. Inspectors were bribed or obstructed. Employers found loopholes. Families, still desperate, continued to send children to work. Change came only through decades of struggle, public exposure, and activism, often led by those who had survived the system themselves. Even as reforms slowly emerged, the damage had been done. A generation had been shaped by machines rather than nurture. Their labor powered the rise of American industry, yet their stories were largely erased from celebratory narratives of progress. Skyscrapers rose, railroads expanded, wealth accumulated, but beneath it all lay the invisible labor of children whose lives were consumed before they began. The machine age did not simply change how America worked. It changed who paid the price for that work. Childhood became collateral damage in the pursuit of growth. The nation grew stronger, richer, and louder, while its youngest citizens bore the weight in silence. These children were not anomalies. They were central to the system. Their suffering was not unintended, it was tolerated, rationalized, and sustained. The machines demanded fuel, and America fed them its children. Women without names in the 19th century United States, women existed everywhere yet were recognized almost nowhere. They labored, birthed, endured, and sustained families and economies, but their identities were routinely erased by law, custom, and history. A woman's value was defined not by her personhood, but by her relationship to men, daughter, wife, widow, servant. Her name, once married, was absorbed into another's. Her body became a site of obligation. Her voice, a disruption to be controlled. The legal system codified this erasure. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. Her property, wages, and even her children belonged to her husband. She could not sign contracts, sue in court, or control her own earnings. If abused, she had little recourse. Violence within marriage was considered a private matter, beyond the reach of law. The home, idealized as a place of safety and virtue, was often a place of confinement. Economic dependence was enforced deliberately. Women were discouraged or outright barred from education and skilled professions. When they worked, they were paid a fraction of men's wages, regardless of hours or output. Factory owners preferred women precisely because they were cheaper and less likely to organize. Employers framed this inequality as natural, insisting that women worked only to supplement household income, even when entire families depended on their labor. In textile mills, garment factories, and workshops, women labored long hours under exhausting conditions. Their work was repetitive, physically damaging, and poorly compensated. Injuries were common. Illness spread quickly. Pregnancy offered no protection. A woman could be dismissed for showing signs of weakness, replaced without hesitation. Her labor was necessary, yet her survival was optional. Domestic service offered no refuge. Young women employed in private homes lived under constant surveillance, isolated from family and community. Their working hours were undefined, their privacy non-existent. Abuse, verbal, physical, sexual, was widespread and rarely acknowledged. Complaints risked dismissal and homelessness. Silence became a survival strategy. For enslaved women and indigenous women, the violence was even more extreme. Enslaved women were denied both bodily autonomy and legal recognition. Sexual exploitation was routine, normalized, and profitable. Their reproductive capacity was controlled to increase wealth, their children claimed as property. Indigenous women faced displacement, assault, and cultural destruction as part of colonial expansion. Their suffering existed outside public sympathy, dismissed as inevitable or invisible. Reproduction itself became a burden imposed rather than a choice. Women endured frequent pregnancies, dangerous childbirth, and high mortality rates with minimal medical support. Pain was accepted as destiny. Death was common. A woman's life could be consumed by reproduction, her body exhausted long before old age. Yet motherhood, when performed under suffering, was romanticized as virtue rather than recognized as labor. Education for women was limited and conditional. Intellectual ambition was treated as rebellion. Women who sought knowledge were ridiculed, accused of abandoning femininity or threatening social order. Those who spoke publicly or challenged authority were labeled immoral or unstable. Silence was enforced through shame as much as law. Even within reform movements, women were often sidelined. They organized, protested, wrote, and taught, yet leadership and recognition went to men. Their labor built movements that excluded them. When women demanded rights, property ownership, education, suffrage, they were told to wait, to be patient, to trust that progress would eventually include them. It rarely did without struggle. Violence against women was pervasive and normalized. Assaults were underreported and unpunished. Courts questioned victims rather than perpetrators. A woman's reputation mattered more than her safety. Respectability became a fragile shield. Once lost, it justified further abuse. Poor women, immigrant women, and women of color were especially vulnerable, their suffering dismissed as consequence rather than crime. The erasure extended into history itself. Records preserved the names of men who built industries, passed laws, and fought wars. Women appeared as footnotes, if at all. Their labor, domestic, emotional, reproductive, was deemed natural and therefore unworthy of recognition. Generations lived and died without acknowledgement, their contributions absorbed into a narrative that credited others, yet resistance persisted. Women organized quietly and publicly. They formed mutual aid networks, shared knowledge, taught one another to read and write, and challenged injustice in the spaces available to them. Some spoke openly, risking ridicule and punishment. Others resisted through endurance, preserving dignity in systems designed to deny it. The 19th century did not simply limit women, it defined them out of full humanity. Their names were taken. Their choices restricted. Their labor exploited. The nation advanced while insisting their sacrifices were invisible, inevitable, or irrelevant. To understand America's past, one must confront this absence. A society that silences half its population cannot claim moral progress. The story of the nation is incomplete without the women whose lives were consumed to sustain it, women remembered not by the names history forgot, but by the weight they carried in silence. The color of the law is often imagined as impartial, a structure built to protect justice and order. In 19th-century America, however, the law was neither neutral nor blind. It saw color clearly, and it enforced hierarchy with precision. While violence in the streets and fields was visible and immediate, the violence of the law was quieter, more enduring, and far more effective. It did not merely permit inequality, it engineered it. Through statutes, court rulings, and enforcement practices, the American legal system transformed racial prejudice into permanent structure. From the nation's earliest years, law defined who counted as fully human and who did not. Citizenship, property ownership, voting rights, and legal testimony were all filtered through race. Enslaved people were excluded entirely from the legal community, while free black people existed in a fragile limbo, their rights conditional and easily revoked. Native Americans were treated as obstacles rather than citizens, governed by treaties that could be broken at will. The law did not restrain power, it served it. After emancipation, the promise of equality briefly appeared in constitutional language, but enforcement told a different story. Laws were written broadly and applied selectively. Freed people were technically no longer property, yet they were immediately targeted by new legal mechanisms designed to control their labor and movement. Black codes criminalized everyday behavior, loitering, unemployment, speaking loudly, failing to show deference. These laws were not responses to crime, they were tools to recreate slavery in another form. Conviction carried consequences beyond punishment. Those found guilty under these vague laws were fined amounts they could not pay. Failure to pay led to imprisonment. From there, labor contracts followed. Convict leasing allowed private companies to rent prisoners from the state, forcing them into brutal labor under conditions often worse than slavery. Death rates were high. Accountability was non-existent. The law had transformed freedom into a technicality, courts upheld this system with consistency. Judges interpreted the Constitution narrowly when it came to racial equality and broadly when it came to state authority. Supreme Court decisions reinforced segregation, upheld discriminatory practices, and signaled to states that racial hierarchy would not be challenged. The law did not need to mention race explicitly, it operated through custom, precedent, and enforcement patterns that ensured predictable outcomes. Policing emerged as an extension of this legal framework. Law enforcement focused disproportionately on communities of color, enforcing minor infractions with severity while ignoring violence committed against them. The role of police was not merely to prevent crime, but to maintain order as defined by those in power. Surveillance, harassment, and arbitrary arrests became routine. Fear replaced protection, voting rights followed the same pattern. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and residency requirements were framed as neutral measures, yet they were designed to exclude specific populations. White voters were assisted, exempted, or overlooked. Black voters were scrutinized, challenged, and intimidated. The right to participate in democracy became a privilege guarded by bureaucracy and violence. Property law further reinforced inequality. Redlining, restrictive covenants, and discriminatory lending practices limited where people of color could live and own land. Wealth accumulated for some while others were permanently excluded. The law protected ownership while denying access, ensuring that economic gaps widened with each generation. Native Americans remained subject to a separate legal reality. Sovereignty was recognized only when convenient. Federal authority overrode tribal governance. Land allotment policies fragmented communal landholdings, transferring vast territories into non-native hands through legal mechanisms that appeared orderly but functioned as theft. The law spoke in contracts and deeds, disguising dispossession as administration. Even when violence was obvious, justice remained elusive. Lynching, assault, and intimidation were rarely punished. Courts failed to prosecute perpetrators. Juries were all white. Victims were blamed. Silence became policy. The absence of justice sent a clear message: some lives were protected by law, others were exposed to it. Language played a crucial role. Terms like public order, states' rights, and separate but equal masked the reality of exclusion. By framing oppression as legality, the system avoided moral scrutiny. Injustice did not need to justify itself, it only needed to be lawful. The power of this system lay in its permanence. Laws outlived individuals. Precedents accumulated. Practices normalized. Even those who did not actively hate benefited from structures designed to advantage them. The law shaped outcomes quietly, consistently, and relentlessly. Resistance existed within and against the legal system. Activists challenged unjust laws, organized communities, and demanded recognition. Some victories were achieved, but progress was slow and fragile. Each gain was met with new restrictions, new interpretations, new ways to preserve hierarchy without naming it. The color of the law was not accidental. It was chosen, refined, and defended. It allowed the nation to claim fairness while practicing exclusion, to speak of rights while denying them, to enforce order while producing injustice. The law did not merely reflect racial inequality, it created it, protected it, and passed it forward. To understand America's past, one must recognize that injustice was not only a failure of morality, but a success of design. The law did exactly what it was built to do. And its legacy did not end with the century. It continued, reshaped but recognizable, long after the ink had dried. Poverty as policy. Poverty in 19th-century America was not merely a condition, it was a mechanism. It was produced, maintained, and manipulated to serve economic, social, and political ends. The nation's growth and wealth were inseparable from the suffering of its poorest citizens, who were often trapped by systems designed to keep them powerless. To understand the society of the era, one must recognize that economic hardship was not simply the result of misfortune or individual failure, it was enforced and normalized, a silent instrument of control. In urban centers, industrialization created dense populations of laborers living in conditions of extreme deprivation. Immigrant families arrived seeking opportunity, only to encounter tenement housing without sanitation, clean water, or adequate ventilation. Overcrowding spread disease, cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis killed indiscriminately. Fires, accidents, and structural collapses were common in the cramped, poorly constructed buildings that housed the working poor. Employers profited from this arrangement. Disease weakened workers but did not stop production, low wages kept them hungry and dependent. Rural poverty was equally deliberate. Tenant farming and sharecropping emerged as mechanisms to maintain labor control after the formal end of slavery. Freed black people, unable to access land or capital, were forced into contracts that trapped them in cycles of debt. Landowners lent seeds, tools, and credit at exorbitant interest rates, ensuring that workers' earnings never freed them from obligation. Legal enforcement favored property owners. Contract violations led to eviction, imprisonment, or forced labor. Poverty was a chain invisible to outsiders, yet suffocating to those bound by it. Child labor, already pervasive, was an extension of this policy. Families depended on the wages of children to survive, ensuring that exploitation was multi-generational. Children who worked in factories, mines, or as domestic laborers were denied education and growth, locking them into a life predetermined by class and circumstance. Their suffering was framed as necessary for progress. Society applauded industrious children while ignoring the cost of their survival. Immigrants were targeted in particular. Irish, Italian, German, and Eastern European arrivals were crowded into neighborhoods with limited services and few opportunities. Employers exploited language barriers, legal ignorance, and desperation. Work was dangerous, low-paying, and endless. Laws regulating safety or wages were weak, selectively enforced, or openly ignored. Poverty became an invisible tether, keeping newcomers compliant and subordinate. Assimilation was secondary to survival. Women bore the double burden of economic exploitation. Paid less than men and often relegated to informal or domestic labor, women's wages were insufficient to provide for themselves or their children. Marriage or dependency on a man became a survival strategy more than a personal choice. Widowhood or abandonment immediately triggered extreme vulnerability. Institutions offered little relief, social support systems were minimal, selective, and often punitive. Hunger and exhaustion were constant companions. The federal and state governments rarely intervened in meaningful ways. Charity was encouraged, but aid was inconsistent, morally conditional, and often tied to labor or conformity. Public welfare existed to manage the poor, not to lift them. Relief required proof of moral fitness or public obedience, reinforcing the idea that poverty was personal failure rather than structural violence. Those unable to demonstrate virtue were punished, marginalized, or removed. Workhouses, poor farms, and prisons blurred the line between poverty and criminality, reinforcing the message that destitution was shameful. Race intersected with poverty to magnify its effects. Black and Native American communities were disproportionately confined to the lowest paying, most dangerous work. Racial prejudice ensured that even those able to rise slightly through skill or enterprise were restricted, surveilled, and penalized. Immigrant groups faced similar structural barriers, creating a layered hierarchy in which oppression could be coded as opportunity while enforcing submission. Poverty also served political ends. Dependent populations were less likely to challenge authority, organize collectively, or demand reform. Economic insecurity ensured compliance with laws, reinforced hierarchical social norms, and supplied cheap labor for industrial expansion, agriculture, and urban development. Hunger and desperation became tools to discipline a population, as effective as any law or army. It was policy masquerading as circumstance, strategy disguised as misfortune. Healthcare and sanitation reinforced inequality. Urban hospitals often refused poor patients or segregated them into overcrowded wards with minimal care. Rural communities lacked doctors, nurses, or resources, relying on folk remedies or religious intervention. Disease, malnutrition, and injury were amplified by social structures, yet treated as natural consequences of poverty rather than preventable injustices. Death became routine, predictable, and instructive, teaching compliance through example. Education was similarly weaponized. Public schools existed, but access was limited, attendance was irregular, and quality was low in impoverished areas. Families dependent on children's labor could not allow consistent attendance. Literacy was restricted, reinforcing cycles of economic dependence. Knowledge became a privilege for the few, while structural barriers ensured that poverty remained generational. Resistance and survival persisted despite these barriers. Communities created informal networks of support, food sharing, mutual aid, clandestine schooling, and cooperative labor. Labor movements began to emerge in northern cities, challenging the terms of industrial exploitation. Yet these movements were small compared to the systemic weight of poverty, and their victories were hard-won and fragile. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had become a nation of striking contradictions. Industrial and agricultural wealth accumulated in the hands of relatively few, while millions remained trapped in structural poverty. The illusion of meritocracy was pervasive, obscuring deliberate exploitation. Poverty was presented as individual failure, yet it had been designed, maintained, and leveraged for the benefit of others. To look at 19th-century America without acknowledging the role of poverty as policy is to miss the blueprint of control that underpinned wealth, labor, and power. Hunger, deprivation, and labor exploitation were not incidental, they were engineered. Poverty was not just the absence of wealth, it was a tool, a language, a system, and for many, a cage from which there was no easy escape. The nation's expansion, its industrialization, and its growing political influence were inseparable from this silent, relentless control over human lives. Prisons, chains, and control slavery in the United States did not end with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. It changed form. The physical chains may have been removed, but the mechanisms of control, exploitation, and terror adapted to a new reality. The prisons, labor camps, and legal systems of post-Civil War America became the next instruments through which freedom was curtailed, profit was extracted, and social hierarchy enforced. In many ways, the nation that had once counted enslaved people as property learned how to exploit them as convicts, as debtors, and as citizens stripped of power. Control had evolved, but its objectives remained the same: maintain dominance, extract labor, and deny true autonomy. The transition was facilitated by legislation that criminalized black existence itself. Black codes, enacted across the South, made ordinary behaviors, loitering, vagrancy, unemployment, and even speaking loudly in public, illegal. Freed people, often lacking land, resources, or steady income, fell into these traps with terrifying regularity. Arrests were arbitrary, convictions rapid, and sentences brutal. These laws were not intended to serve justice, they were intended to sustain the racial and economic hierarchy of the antebellum South. The prison system became a substitute for slavery. The gavel replaced the whip, the courtroom replaced the auction block, and the sentence replaced the plantation field. Convict leasing became one of the most insidious forms of this new oppression. States leased prisoners to private companies, plantations, and industrial operations, often under conditions far worse than those faced under slavery. Men, women, and even teenagers were subjected to brutal labor in coal mines, railroads, textile mills, and lumber camps. Death, injury, and disease were routine. Guards were unaccountable. Companies prioritized profit above human life. Mortality rates skyrocketed, yet the system endured because it was profitable, legal, and socially accepted. The prisoner's racial identity was central. This was not a system designed to punish criminals universally but to perpetuate racialized control. Prisons became factories of exploitation. Inmates were forced into grueling labor, sometimes chained, sometimes confined in spaces without ventilation or sanitation. Malnutrition, exposure, and neglect were routine. Legal protections were weak or non-existent. Lawyers, judges, and legislators all participated in maintaining a system that stripped incarcerated people of autonomy while extracting value from their bodies. Convict labor fed industries and infrastructure, from railroads cutting across southern states to urban construction projects in northern cities. What had been considered morally abhorrent under slavery was now sanitized as legality. Segregation extended beyond prisons into every aspect of civic life. Schools, public transport, and housing enforced strict racial boundaries. These measures were backed by law, enforced through policing, and normalized through culture. The patterns of oppression that had once dictated plantation life were now embedded in urban and rural institutions alike. Freedom existed in theory but was constrained in practice. Economic independence was blocked, political participation restricted, and physical mobility monitored. The chains were gone, but the cage remained. The penal system was also a laboratory for experimentation in social control. Discipline, punishment, and rehabilitation were framed as neutral or moral, but they disproportionately targeted people of color. Public labor, fines, and surveillance created networks of dependency that reinforced inequality. The legal system reasserted dominance in ways subtle and overt, ensuring that even those not imprisoned felt the consequences of defiance. Fear of arrest, humiliation, or legal reprisal became another means of social control. Women and children were not exempt from these mechanisms. Black women, in particular, were criminalized for survival behaviors, stealing food, seeking work without documentation, or resisting sexual exploitation. Children were funneled into juvenile facilities that trained them to be obedient laborers, often separated from families, deprived of education, and subjected to corporal punishment. The patterns of exploitation learned in childhood persisted into adulthood, ensuring generational cycles of dependence and subjugation. Northern cities were not innocent bystanders. Urban poverty, immigrant labor, and industrial exploitation created parallel systems of control. Police forces surveilled working-class neighborhoods. Courts imposed fines, sentences, and work obligations selectively. Contract labor, apprenticeship programs, and workhouses ensured that certain populations, especially people of color and immigrants, remained trapped in cycles of exploitation. Freedom was conditional, subject to compliance, and continuously under threat. The broader social effect of these systems was profound. By criminalizing survival and exploiting incarceration, the nation created a permanent underclass. Wealth and power accumulated in the hands of a few while systemic poverty, labor exploitation, and surveillance maintained dominance over millions. Laws, prisons, and contracts replaced the overt brutality of the plantation with mechanisms that were bureaucratic, legitimate, and, in many ways, invisible. Resistance persisted, but it was perilous. Prison strikes, legal challenges, escapes, and advocacy by abolitionists, reformers, and community leaders attempted to push back against the system. Yet each victory was limited. Structures had been carefully constructed to adapt to change, preserving inequality even in the face of reform. Social control had learned from slavery and perfected itself. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had achieved a transformation. The nation appeared free, civilized, and law-abiding. Yet beneath the veneer, the machinery of oppression was operational, sophisticated, and durable. The chains of slavery had been replaced by the invisible chains of law, debt, and coercion. The faces had changed, but the system's logic remained the same. Human life was a resource, freedom conditional, and control absolute. Prisons, labor camps, and legal mechanisms were not anomalies, they were extensions of centuries-old strategies of dominance. They revealed a chilling truth: America had learned to exploit, punish, and subjugate without relying on overt ownership. The new form of slavery was efficient, hidden, and legally sanctioned. It endured for decades because it worked, not for the good of citizens, but for the accumulation of wealth, power, and social hierarchy. Understanding this reality is essential to understanding America itself. The abolition of slavery did not abolish oppression. It refined it. It moved it into institutions, into paperwork, and into the mechanisms of control that would define the modern era. Freedom was promised, but its delivery was conditional, surveilled, and structured to fail. The new chains were legal, permanent, and in many ways, invisible, but their weight was felt every day, in every street, mill, and courtroom. War, profit, and blood. War is often described in abstract terms: strategy, honor, heroism, and nationhood. Yet the Civil War, celebrated as a conflict over freedom and union, was also a theater of unimaginable suffering, profiteering, and exploitation. While thousands died on battlefields, millions more endured conditions designed to extract labor, reinforce hierarchy, and enrich those positioned to profit from chaos. In many ways, the war was both a moral struggle and a business, and human lives were the raw materials. The conflict consumed the nation between 1861 and 1865, yet its impact reached far beyond soldiers. Enslaved people, newly emancipated, faced relentless uncertainty. Northern and Southern economies both relied on labor to sustain industries, agriculture, and military supply chains. Women, children, and the poor filled factories, workshops, and hospitals under grueling conditions. Hunger, exhaustion, and disease were rampant, yet their labor was indispensable. Survival depended on compliance, endurance, and often silence. Profit dictated strategy as much as ideology. Northern industrialists and Southern landowners alike recognized that war created opportunity. Weapons manufacturers, uniform suppliers, and transportation networks expanded rapidly. Contracts for cannons, rifles, and ammunition were often awarded with little oversight, producing immense wealth for a few while exposing workers to dangerous and exploitative conditions. Factories operated around the clock, and accidents, illness, and death were normalized. Labor was essential, yet expendable. Enslaved labor remained central in the South even as armies marched. Fields continued to produce cotton, tobacco, and food for the Confederacy, often under coercion, threat, or compulsion. Escapes and resistance increased, but the demand for productivity was relentless. The Union, too, relied indirectly on these systems, importing goods and raw materials that had been cultivated through forced labor. War did not disrupt exploitation, it intensified it. Prisons and workhouses expanded as instruments of wartime control. Political dissidents, deserters, and marginalized populations were confined under harsh conditions, often for minor infractions. Labor was extracted under supervision, feeding supply chains and infrastructure projects critical to the war effort. Disease and injury were omnipresent. Mortality was high, and accountability minimal. The machinery of control, developed over decades, adapted seamlessly to the demands of wartime. Women played indispensable but undervalued roles. They ran households in the absence of men, managed farms and businesses, and filled industrial and medical positions. Many served as nurses, often under rudimentary and unsanitary conditions. Infection, exposure, and exhaustion were constant threats. Their contributions were essential, yet their suffering was rendered invisible in official accounts. Recognition was rare, compensation minimal, and protection non-existent. Survival demanded self-sacrifice as a condition of loyalty, not choice. Children, too, bore the weight of war. Orphaned or left to maintain households, they entered factories, fields, and workshops far too young. Their labor supplemented depleted family incomes, perpetuating cycles of exhaustion, injury, and lost education. In some instances, children served directly in military logistics, transporting supplies, tending horses, and cleaning weapons, exposed to disease, violence, and psychological trauma. Childhood, like freedom, was conditional. The human cost of profiteering was staggering. Hospitals and battlefield supply chains were often mismanaged for financial gain. Contractors skimped on food, clothing, and medical supplies to increase profit margins. Soldiers, prisoners, and civilians alike suffered because efficiency and oversight were secondary to wealth accumulation. Corruption became systemic. Bribery, embezzlement, and favoritism ensured that those with connections prospered while the vulnerable paid the ultimate price. Racialized exploitation persisted unabated. Freed black people were coerced into labor contracts under the pretext of employment, often under conditions resembling slavery. They were forced to work for minimal wages, punished for resistance, and denied legal protections. Even as the Emancipation Proclamation promised freedom, structural mechanisms ensured that economic dependence, surveillance, and coercion continued. The war, for many, replaced one form of bondage with another, often invisible but equally constraining. Economic inequality intensified. Landowners, industrialists, and military contractors amassed wealth unprecedented in scale, while laborers, soldiers, and the enslaved endured physical and psychological depletion. The mechanisms that had previously structured exploitation, legal enforcement, debt, racial hierarchy, and coercion, were amplified by wartime urgency. Human suffering became both a tool and a commodity. The aftermath of war left the nation scarred. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, and populations displaced. Yet the systems that enabled exploitation adapted, rather than disappeared. Freed black people faced black codes, sharecropping, and convict leasing. Industrial labor remained harsh, unregulated, and dangerous. Women returned to roles of dependency and invisibility, and children continued to labor under oppressive conditions. War had destroyed bodies, economies, and communities, but it had also reinforced the structures that allowed a few to profit from the suffering of many. Memory and myth obscured these realities. The war was celebrated as a moral victory, with soldiers' heroism foreground and systemic exploitation erased. Industrial profiteering, coerced labor, and racialized control were minimized or ignored. History was written by those who had survived and benefited, while the stories of the laboring, the exploited, and the oppressed were footnotes at best. Wealth and narrative power remained concentrated, as they always had. In the end, the Civil War demonstrated that conflict and exploitation are inseparable when economic, racial, and social hierarchies are entrenched. The nation's expansion, industrialization, and political consolidation were not only secured through sacrifice, they were financed, enabled, and maintained through the suffering of the most vulnerable. Profit, blood, and control became inseparable. The machinery of oppression had been refined, tested, and normalized in the theater of war, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the guns fell silent. Erasure in memory history is not only what happened, it is what we choose to remember, what we record, and what we teach. In America, memory has always been selective, shaped by those in power to conceal inconvenient truths. The stories of the enslaved, the oppressed, the exploited, and the marginalized are often footnotes, if they appear at all. Monuments rise to generals and presidents, textbooks celebrate progress, and narratives of freedom and triumph obscure centuries of suffering and exploitation. This erasure is not accidental, it is deliberate. From the earliest years of the Republic, memory was curated to protect the image of the nation. Founding fathers were lionized, their contradictions minimized. The realities of slavery, native dispossession, and the systemic exploitation of the poor were muted. Public narratives glorified discovery while ignoring destruction, celebrated innovation while concealing oppression. Historical erasure created a comfortable mythology, a nation born in liberty, guided by virtue, and progressing inevitably toward justice. In truth, the path of the United States has always been paved with exploitation, exclusion, and violence. Education played a crucial role in shaping collective memory. Textbooks presented sanitized histories that highlighted white achievement and minimized the labor, creativity, and suffering of others. The role of women, children, Native Americans, African Americans, immigrants, and the working poor was minimized or ignored. Resistance was romanticized when it fit the narrative, erased when inconvenient. Generations were taught to admire triumph while forgetting the cost. Memory became a tool of social control, instilling pride in a selective past while obscuring accountability. Public monuments and commemorations reinforced this selective history. Statues of generals, industrialists, and political leaders celebrated their accomplishments, rarely acknowledging the lives destroyed in the process. Wars were memorialized for heroism, never for the systemic exploitation that sustained them. Slavery, forced labor, and racial violence were obscured in favor of narratives of progress. Landscapes, streets, and institutions were named in honor of oppressors, ensuring that memory itself served the interests of power. Media, literature, and popular culture participated in the erasure. Novels, films, and newspapers portrayed a romanticized America, the benevolent planter, the loyal servant, the industrious immigrant, the heroic soldier. Violence and exploitation were softened or justified. Stories of rebellion, survival, and resistance were minimized, framed as anomalies rather than central experiences. In this way, the culture reinforced the message that suffering was peripheral, and power was natural. The process of erasure was particularly evident regarding Native Americans. Entire civilizations, languages, and spiritual practices were erased from public consciousness. Maps replaced tribal lands with states and counties, legal documents replaced oral histories, and the vanishing Indian myth recast forced displacement and genocide as inevitable. Memory became a weapon, enabling society to claim progress without reckoning with the crimes committed in the process. African American history faced a similar fate. The brutality of slavery, the systemic oppression during Reconstruction, the violence of Jim Crow, and the exploitation of labor were minimized or reframed. Emancipation was celebrated as a moral triumph, while the continuing subjugation through economic, legal, and social means was ignored. Resistance, innovation, and cultural contributions were often unrecognized. Memory demanded that suffering be invisible or morally sanitized. Women were erased through a combination of legal invisibility, social expectation, and cultural narrative. Their labor, domestic, industrial, reproductive, intellectual, was treated as natural, unremarkable, and therefore unworthy of recognition. Their struggles, achievements, and resistance were footnotes to male-centered history. Even those who fought for suffrage, education, or labor rights were often written out of mainstream narratives. In public memory, women's contributions were optional, their suffering invisible, their names forgotten. Erasure is not passive, it shapes identity and power in the present. When history is rewritten to highlight only the achievements of the powerful, social inequality is justified, normalized, and naturalized. Systems of labor, law, and governance are presented as neutral when they are not. Citizens are taught to admire, rather than question, the foundations of their nation. Myths obscure the reality that freedom and opportunity were and continue to be conditional, yet erasure is never complete. Oral histories, cultural preservation, and community memory persist despite suppression. Songs, stories, and rituals maintain the presence of those whom official records neglect. Activists, historians, and scholars have worked to reclaim what was erased, to shine light on hidden truths, and to challenge the sanitized national narrative. Their work reveals that memory is contested, not fixed, and that understanding the past requires confronting what has been intentionally forgotten. The consequences of erasure extend into the present. Contemporary inequality, racial tension, and social injustice are rooted in histories that were hidden or rewritten. By forgetting, society absolves itself of responsibility. By remembering selectively, it validates structures that were never equitable. To confront America's present, one must confront what has been erased from its past. Memory is both a weapon and a key, it can oppress, or it can liberate. Erasure ensures that injustice continues unnoticed. Memory allows recovery, accountability, and transformation. To study history honestly is to embrace discomfort, to acknowledge exploitation, and to recognize the labor, suffering, and resistance of those who have been silenced. The stories of the enslaved, the oppressed, the marginalized, and the exploited do not disappear because history attempts to hide them. They persist in culture, in family memory, in the land, and in the consequences that echo into every corner of modern life. To remember is to resist. To remember is to honor the lives erased by laws, systems, and ideologies. To remember is to reject the convenient myths that have justified violence, exploitation, and inequality. History is not simply the past, it is the lens through which power operates. America's story, if told honestly, is a story of labor, suffering, control, and resilience. Memory may be contested, but it is never optional. The shadows of modern inequality. The 20th century did not erase the injustices of the past, it refined them. The machinery of oppression, honed over centuries, adapted to new social, political, and economic landscapes. Systems that once relied on chains, plantations, and overt exclusion evolved into subtle networks of segregation, economic inequality, and institutionalized discrimination. Poverty, labor exploitation, legal control, and social marginalization continue to define the lives of millions, even as the nation proclaimed progress, democracy, and equality. Industrialization intensified, creating opportunities for growth that were unevenly distributed. Corporations expanded, cities grew, and technological advancement accelerated. Yet the benefits of these transformations were rarely shared equally. African Americans, indigenous communities, women, immigrants, and the working poor continued to face structural barriers that limited mobility and opportunity. Redlining, discriminatory labor practices, unequal education, and wage gaps ensured that social hierarchy remained rigid. Poverty was not accidental, it was engineered through policy, practice, and prejudice. Segregation persisted as both law and custom. The Jim Crow system in the South codified racial inequality, dictating where black people could live, work, learn, worship, and even whom they could marry. In northern and western cities, de facto segregation confined marginalized communities to under-resourced neighborhoods, schools, and jobs. The mechanisms of exclusion were no longer plantations or chains, but zoning laws, credit denial, and political disenfranchisement. Opportunity was conditional, freedom partial, and equality a promise deferred indefinitely. Labor exploitation continued under new forms. Children still worked in industries where education was scarce, though formal child labor laws slowly limited the youngest. Adult workers faced low wages, unsafe conditions, and limited union protections. Women, long invisible in historical narratives, were now essential to factories, offices, and households, yet faced systemic discrimination, sexual harassment, and wage inequality. Immigrants and racial minorities were concentrated in the most dangerous, least paid, and least protected positions, ensuring that the foundations of the economy rested on inequitable labor. The criminal justice system, refined over the previous century, became another instrument of control. Convict leasing gave way to mass incarceration, a system disproportionately targeting people of color. Prisons became warehouses for those marginalized by poverty, race, or both, while labor within correctional institutions fueled profit for states and corporations. Legal enforcement, sentencing disparities, and policing practices reproduced the inequalities of the past under the guise of law and order. The chains were gone, but the cage persisted. Education, long heralded as a path to opportunity, remained unequal. Segregation in schools, unequal funding, and systemic discrimination limited the potential of millions. Access to higher education and professional advancement was shaped by wealth, race, and gender. Knowledge was not equally distributed, it remained a tool of power, a means of preserving hierarchy, and a barrier to liberation. Those denied education were denied the possibility of escaping cycles of oppression. Public memory continued to be curated selectively. History textbooks, monuments, and media celebrated national achievements while ignoring systemic injustice. The contributions of marginalized groups were often minimized, their suffering sanitized or erased. Myths of meritocracy, democracy, and inevitable progress obscured the reality that structural inequality had been deliberate, not accidental. As in previous centuries, the stories of the oppressed were marginalized, while the narratives of the powerful dominated public consciousness, yet resistance endured. Civil rights movements, labor organizing, women's rights campaigns, and grassroots activism challenged systemic injustice. African Americans, indigenous peoples, immigrants, women, and working-class communities demanded recognition, opportunity, and equity. Social movements, though often met with violence, repression, or co-optation, revealed the resilience and agency of those whom history had sought to erase. Progress was slow, incomplete, and often contested, but it demonstrated that oppression, no matter how entrenched, was never total. Inequality in modern America is the shadow of centuries-old systems. It is not simply the result of personal failure or misfortune, but the cumulative effect of legal, social, and economic structures that have persisted and adapted. From native dispossession to slavery, from child labor to mass incarceration, each system has left a legacy. Its effects are visible in neighborhoods, schools, workplaces, and prisons. The nation's wealth and stability have always depended on the exploitation of some to benefit others. The promise of equality remains aspirational, constantly deferred by structural forces. To conclude, this story is not to declare victory or closure. It is to recognize that history is not linear progress, but a continuum in which oppression evolves, adapts, and persists. The chains of one era are replaced by the policies, practices, and institutions of the next. The struggle for recognition, justice, and equality continues. Memory, resistance, and awareness are the tools through which society can confront the legacies of injustice and begin to dismantle them. The shadows of modern inequality are long, stretching back centuries, yet they are not immutable. They survive because systems allow them to, because history has been selectively remembered, and because power has always been concentrated in the hands of a few. Understanding them requires confronting uncomfortable truths, acknowledging those whom history sought to erase, and recognizing that progress is not inevitable, it is fought for, earned, and maintained through awareness and action. America, for all its wealth, innovation, and promise, has always been built upon exploitation, exclusion, and control. The shadows of that history are visible today, in poverty, incarceration, labor exploitation, educational inequity, and racial and gender discrimination. But to see the shadows is to have the power to challenge them. To remember is to resist. To confront the past is to shape a more just future, and so, the story ends not with resolution, but with recognition. Oppression has evolved, inequality persists, and the struggle for justice continues. The nation's history is a mirror, reflecting both the achievements it celebrates and the suffering it obscures. Only by acknowledging both can the full story be told. This concludes your full historical series, from colonial exploitation, slavery, native dispossession, industrial labor, women's erasure, legal oppression, systemic poverty, or profiteering, mass incarceration, and selective memory, to the modern shadows of inequality.